Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this seminar series here at the Center for Leadership and Empowerment. You all have very busy schedule, but you've taken time off your busy schedules to be here. So we are extremely grateful for that. This particular seminar is the fifth in a row. We've had 4 previous sessions, and today we have a very exciting presentation by Reverend Professor Will Foster. But before I talk a little bit about Reverend Professor Will Foster, I'm just gonna ask the Center Director, Professor Christine Harrison, to give us a word.
Thanks very much, Lawrence, for the opportunity, and thanks everybody here today. And like Lawrence rightly pointed out, it's a busy time for many people, and we really appreciate you spending some time here. I asked initially where people are, and of course, many of us are in the UK, and I think the sun is shining today. It's not so bad, so it's a lot of people that would love to get some sun, but you're here. So thank you so much for being here today. Of course, like Lawrence rightly pointed out, I'm Professor Christian Harrison, and privileged to be the founding director for the Center for Leadership and Empowerment. I always say that our center is the most important center in the university, and I think Will is nodding, and that's the truth. He's not being arrogant, it's a fact, because leadership is very important. We know famous philosopher that's Heraclitus that says change is the only constant thing. I believe that leadership is the only constant thing, because in the world today, effective leadership is very important. For those of you that are following political leadership, you will see that we have another election coming up in July 4th. So you can see that leadership is so important. And that was why this center was started, so that we can talk about leadership and also try to tell people about the effective leadership discourse. And it's a privilege to have Professor Will Foster here today. Will is a good friend and also a colleague. And when I told him about this, he said, Christian, I will be here today. Will is meant to be on annual leave. So you can see, and he's here, and we know what it means for someone to be on annual leave. Well, Will said, no, despite me being on annual leave, I'm going to do this for you. So I'm so happy, and I appreciate you, Will, for being here today, despite all. And looking forward, of course, I know Lawrence is going to tell us so much about his impressive CV, so I'm not going to start on that. Don't worry, you'll hear all about that. But thank you, everyone, for coming, and I'm sure you would have a great experience. One of the things that we do as a center, we do a lot of activities. So this is just one of the activities that we do. And for many of you that know about our conference, although we'll talk about it at the end, we have a conference we're going to do next month as well. So we do a lot of things, and the whole idea is to ensure that we have this public discourse. So keep following us and watch our activities, and follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, and all that. So thank you for coming.
Thank you very much, Professor Christine Harrison, for that warm welcome. Before we proceed, I would just like to say a few words about Reverend Professor Will Foster. Yes, I have to put Reverend because he is a Reverend. Reverend Professor Will Foster is a senior consultant on leadership, organizational development, and research with Advanced HE. He gained his chair as the founding professor of leadership at Keele University and was the first academic to gain professorial status on the education and scholarship route for his sustained applied academic leadership and scholarship. He is honorary professor with Waverley Abbey and holds a PhD from King's College, London, in ecclesiology, leadership, and organizational culture. His most recent book, has been published by Brill. Following a successful 15-year commercial leadership and senior consultancy career, he moved into higher education, where he brought his pioneering spirit for business change to academic leadership roles for 17 years as associate and acting dean and head of school and provost Dean at the University of Wolverhampton, and then 3 years as Professor of Leadership and Director of MBA and Executive Education at Keele University. Will has a rich and deep understanding and experience of leadership, culture, strategy, and change, and has extensive experience of executive coaching and group facilitation. Beyond his work in higher education, he has designed and led programs for CEOs, directors, and senior and aspiring leaders from a diverse range of sectors, and has acted as principal consultant, advisor, and coach to CEOs and principals of private HE providers. In a voluntary non-executive capacity, he has served as board member, director, trustee for a number of charities, including Trusted Executive Foundation, Saltmine Trust, Q3 Multi Academy Trust, and the Church at Junction 10. He was Chief Executive Examiner, Chief External Examiner for the University of Creative Arts, including 18-month revalidation of entire business school provision from 2019 to 2022, and has also acted as external advisor and academic validation analyst for Birmingham Newman University BA and MA entire suite of partner programs 2024 to 2028. Upper Adams BA Agri-Business Degrees 2024, and Suffolk University Global MBA 2023, University College London MSc Global Healthcare Leadership Program 2022. In October 2022, we joined Advanced HE to serve the higher education sector nationally and internationally by leading professional recognition, launching and implementing the ESF Professional Standard Framework 2023, and helping lead the consultation on a higher education leadership framework. He now devotes his efforts to leadership consultancy, leadership development, and contributing to the design of leadership programs. Without further ado, please join me to welcome Reverend Professor Will Foster to the virtual stage. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Lawrence. That was one of the longest introductions I think I've had. I was about to receive my MBE then or something, so that's really, really kind of you. I'm really pleased to be here. Thank you, Christian, for the invite. Thank you, Lawrence, for hosting us. And it's really good to see such smiling and friendly people that will be talking together today. I can tell from the way that you introduced yourselves earlier that we're going to have a good time. I'd really like to get to know you all a little bit better. So what I'll do is throughout the presentation, we'll pause, we'll take some input, and perhaps if you're giving your input, you can say not only who you are, but where you're coming from, what your role is, your employer, and what you do. So if I can just share my screen, that looks as though it's working. So yeah, it's a real pleasure to be here, as I said, and oh, that's not worked, so bear with me again. Let's just pop that again. There's obviously a button down here that I clicked that was the wrong button. There we go. So just as a tentative outline, and I'll put a tentative outline because, you know, I'd like the conversation to take us where the conversation takes us. But the approach I'd like to take today is interactive. I want us to explore some dominant and some emergent themes together around leadership and culture. Ideally co-creational. Obviously, that depends on you. I'm happy. Christian knows I could spend the whole hour talking. It's not a problem. But ideally, it'd be great to have some conversation and to share our thoughts and experiences. Developmental, I'd really like to think about how some of the ideas today might shape our leadership practice going forward. And, you know, like us to take a questioning approach. What does everything mean for, and I've put leadership and empowerment because at the end of the day, that is the name of the centre that Christian has invited me from, the Centre for Leadership and Empowerment. So a short introduction to locate the conversation today. I'm going to look at 3 premises as a stimulus, something about leadership, something about culture, something about change, and then what all this means for us. And today, I mean, working for Advance HE, we are a global organisation, but today I'm going to bring it down to mainly a UK focus, if that's okay. If we have people from other parts of the world, then that's brilliant. And you can please do bring those other perspectives into the conversation. But as Christian will know, because he's seen a few of my talks, I like to start off with Simon Weston's quote from his book, Leadership Critical Text that was based on his PhD. And Simon says, locating ourselves is important as leaders because all leadership is biographical. And leadership ideas emerge from the messiness of a wide variety of settings rather than the tidiness of academic. And what this does is this enables us to place ourselves within the leadership conversation. And it also means that our experiences are just as valid as the academic theories that we might bring that experience into interaction with. So I think you've already had a more than adequate introduction, but the 15 years I spent in industry was with Rolls-Royce, with Jonathan Lee and with Cleeve School. And then I moved into academia. I worked at Wolverhampton and studied a PhD at King's, worked for Kiel, now work for Advance HE. Sat on the board of Salt Mine, Q3 and the Trusted Executive, and have an ongoing relationship with Waverley Abbey. I'm honorary professor. I'm just about to join the boards of London School of Theology and Regent's Theological College, and I've been with Junction 10 for a while. And as was said at the beginning, my monograph was published in February, and it really was a deep dive into leadership and culture for a major denomination in the UK, a Pentecostal denomination. So that gives you, this is where, when I say all leadership is biographical, this is where whenever I talk about leadership, I always try and bring experiences from these diverse settings. So a 1-minute group question, and I can't see you very well on my main screen, but what I can do is I've got 2 computers on the go. So if you see a little dot as one of the participants, I'm actually here twice. So let me ask the question, 1 minute quickly. Why is leadership important? I originally was going to ask, is leadership important? But on the basis that Christian's already said it's important, and on the basis that we're all here interested in leadership, my assumption is everybody thinks it's important. But why? Why is leadership important? So I don't know whether you could put something in the chat bar or whether you're prepared to unmute and talk. But who'd like to venture an opinion as why leadership's important?
Well, for me, I feel, or I think leadership is important because where there's no leadership, chaos tends to exist, whether it's in a business setting, whether it's in the home, even in the church. So that's why it's very important.
Thank you. So leadership is important. Where there's a vacuum of leadership, we get chaos. And James has put to provide direction. So leadership is important to provide direction. More conversation, more ideas. We're a quiet bunch today. Go on, sorry.
Hi, I'm Anne Cleary. I work in the School of Clinical Biomedical Science. I'm a nurse by background. And I think leadership in the context of my experience is important because people need nurturing, they need empowering to work within teams in healthcare, and they need somebody sometimes help provide a bit of direction. But also I think the other thing about leadership is it's how you provide it that's really important. And it's not, it's not easy sometimes. It's something that you really have to pay attention to.
That's brilliant because on the slide that I use, when I say I usually, I've got a few slides that I like to drop in occasionally. And the other one, the other question we won't be answering today is, why is leadership hard? But it's really good that you've identified that leadership isn't straightforward. It is hard. It is difficult. Any final thoughts before we move on? Anyone else prepared to venture a thought?
Well, if I could add, so I'm Professor Sanjoy Bhattacharya. I'm working in the Institute of Medicine, and
Yeah.
I'm a consultant in immersive medicine as well. I think to me, as everyone said, you need somebody to, it's like the dog, the sheepdog who gets all the sheep together. So you need somebody to herd in a collaborative and inclusive manner the team, and leading them towards the common goal. And that's why it can't happen with everyone. You need one person to lead, be it any situation. In my situation, in a clinical environment, leadership is so key, especially in A&E. But that's my view. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you for that. And I like the fact, firstly, that we're talking about not just why it's important, but how leadership should be. What I've just picked up off the desk over there is, in a couple of weeks back, my wife went to Harrogate, and she went to Harrogate to receive her ministry status. So she's now Reverend Foster. We got 2 Reverend Fosters in the house. And typically, because I've decided to do this, it won't open now. Oh, let me try. There we go. But what she was presented with, what all of the people who were graduating were presented with, was this. Can anybody tell me what this is? It's a conductor's baton. And you were talking about sheepdogs and leadership being like sheepdog. That's an interesting metaphor. The metaphor that they used when they were commissioning their leaders was that it came from a person who'd been a conductor for many years, and then he'd written a book, and in this book he'd said, I came to realise after 20 years of conducting an orchestra that I never made a sound, but I drew the sound out of the other players there. So I think that's brilliant. And thank you, Lawrence, for your leadership models behaviour for followers. It sets the vision and agenda. So not just why it's important, but the sort of things that leadership might do. I would say this is my first. I said I've got 3 premises. I have 3 premises on which I base, my thoughts about leadership. And the first one is that leadership is important because, as John Maxwell says, everything rises and falls on leadership. And you only have to think, anybody who's been in an organisation, anybody who sent their children to a school. I know that when Vicky and I were looking which schools to send our children to when they were young, you could have a brilliant primary school, and then you'd have a change of head teacher, and within 6 months things could radically change, just because that leadership style, that leadership approach, that leadership capability or lack of it had changed as well. So everything rises and falls on leadership. So what I'd like you to do, if you possibly can, is scan the QR code or head over to that link, and there's a Padlet there, and in the Padlet, could we share there's 2 sections, one for now and one for later. One is about dominant and emergent leadership paradigms. The other one's about organisational culture. We'll deal with that in a bit. But could you head over to the Padlet, and could you put your thoughts on, just very quickly, what do we think have been the dominant leadership paradigms leading up to, let's say the last century, the start of this century? What do we think have been the dominant leadership paradigms? So I can go on this other computer over here, and I've got the Padlet there. So can everybody get into the Padlet, just as a just checking that you can get in? Can you actually add something to the Padlet? I'm just checking that I've got the permissions. Yeah, I can see people writing. Brilliant. Great man theory. Yeah. Dominant leadership paradigm. Crikey, dating back to the 1800s, and yet still very much in evidence. If we look at our politics today, very much in evidence with our politics, very much in evidence with other spheres of leadership that, although this was an idea created in the or conceptualized in the 1800s, still reaches on for today. The transactional paradigm, yeah, that sense of transactional leadership, brilliant. Fantastic. Traits, skills, behavior theory, contingency theory. And what about the emergent ones as well? If you could also populate the emergent paradigms, what sort of things more recently are we sensing? What are we noticing about leadership? What's emerging? And while you're filling that in, oh, somebody's put being authentic in the dominant paradigm. I reckon that's more an emergent theme personally, but yeah, coaching theme. One of the things that that I've noticed, and we'll come on to this in a minute, is that certainly in the sectors that I've worked in, there's been a fairly stable state until relatively recently. And in that stable state, I remember coming into higher education, and because I'd done an MBA in the 90s, I expected universities to be the best led, the most fantastic cultures, the best strategies, you know, because we were teaching this to, you know, the leaders of the future. Yeah, a little bit like a plumber whose house is never quite plumbed as well as they plumb other people's houses. What I realised is that higher education felt to me a little bit more like British Leyland of the 70s rather than, let's say, Toyota of the 90s. So thank you. Please carry on filling in that. Please carry on filling in that Padlet. I'll tell you a few emerging paradigms. Interesting. We've got a couple of people from the NHS, and see whether this rings true with you or not. I worked with the NHS quite a lot when I was at Keele, both in terms of working with the NHS and having executive leaders on my MBA. And I think a real strong theme that I picked up coming out of the King's Fund, really, the King's Trust, was compassionate leadership. That seemed to be having quite a bit of traction. There was a governmental leadership review that was carried out as well a few years back, and what came from all that was the fact that leaders needed more support than what was being given. And I think that's the cultural clues, the dominant paradigms. You know, there's been extreme pressure, complex challenges, certainly bullying, harassment, and racism. It might not be talked about a lot overtly, but when you and I hope colleagues who are here would be able to chime with this. When you sort of lift the lid on the NHS, some of the things that go on there are a little bit worrying, and certainly what came out in the report was a blaming for failure. In fact, General Sir Gordon Messenger, who was commissioned to do this review of NHS leadership, said two telling observations stand out as most universal. Firstly, the very real difference that first-rate leadership can make in health and social care, and there were many outstanding examples of that, but the development of quality leadership and management is not adequately embedded or institutionalized in our healthcare communities. So that was the NHS. In higher education, we did a massive global leadership survey, and there seemed to be a desire for structured attention to leadership development and a desire for authenticity, collaborative and inclusive leadership. But there's lots of complex, conflicted priorities. I think you find that in the NHS as well. There's a bit of a dissonance between people who are leading themselves and being led, recognizing that they have a certain level of leadership capability, but they'd like to see a greater level of leadership capability in other parts of the organization. Also that came out was, this is really important and really interesting, that there was a real desire for reflection, but people feeling they got a lack of time to be able to do that. And what I would say, coming into higher education, it seemed to move from a stable, bureaucratic, democratic, even autocratic base of leadership across many institutions, and then with marketisation of higher education, with massification of higher education, with the government's agenda and the changes that went on, then that changed the nature of leadership. I'm just having a look at some of the comments here. In healthcare, it's compassionate and collective leadership, absolutely. Yeah, converting strategy into operational reality. And this was our chief exec from Advance AG. We recognise the vital importance of higher education in supporting society to tackle the challenges of today and tomorrow. And implicit in this sentence is the critical factor of effective leadership at every level in order for the sector to fulfil its societal role. And then just in terms of I just picked this quote out from Ian Poole just a few months ago, talking about the Church of England, but I've seen this in many different areas. There is a serious crisis in governmental leadership of many different denominations. It's got more than one dimension to it, and with any crisis, it's been a long time coming. And he says here, if your ceiling caves in because water leak has weakened the structures, you can be sure that the water's been leaking for some while. The dimensions of this crisis include questions of role, training, education, selection and appointment of leaders, but also a more fundamentally theological vision. And then just picking up a few things about leadership from post-experience MBA senior leader that I led at Keele. Probably about 250 executive leaders went through the program while I was looking after it. The majority, really interesting, the majority on the program had little or no previous knowledge of leadership theory, yet they were managing directors, chief executive, business owners. Yet when we started to ask about leadership theory, very few had encountered much of it. That was really interesting. The other thing was they were from a diverse range of sectors: NHS, charitable trusts, business owners, tech, manufacturing, engineering, you know, quite a full range of sectors. And given the fact that Hersey and Blanchard had published their situational leadership back in 1982, hardly anybody had heard that. And this was one of the theories that seemed to grab the attention of the leaders. And when we looked at a range of leadership theory and said, well, you know, what are you going to try differently? What are you going to take into practice? This one tended to be the one that people sort of honed in on, maybe because it was quite simple, but quite powerful. And leaders would come back and say, just by using that one theory, it had made a massive difference to the way that they understood their leadership practice and to the feedback they were getting from the people they were leading. And the other thing we found from this was that the deeper understanding of organisational culture that we built into the programme really created a significant and noticeable impact in leaders' practice. And that came out, that was actually evidence, it wasn't anecdotal, but we had tripartite reviews with the employer, the employee and myself. And the employer, who was usually even more senior in the organisation, would be able to notice the impact that had had, not just on them and their leadership, but on the organisation. So that a little bit of sort of noticing that I've had over the last few years. As leaders, is it important to understand the history of leadership thinking and theory? Do you think, yes, it's important to understand, or no, it doesn't matter? And why do you think that? So if you would like to unmute and give me your opinion.
Yeah, I would give my opinion. I think my opinion will be very biased because I'm an academic, isn't it? And I talk about leadership theories and I write about it. So you of course you will know my answer. I would say yes. It's important for people to know about leadership theories, because one of the things that we'll notice is the whole idea of leadership theories that have evolved due to the problems with the previous ones. Then when you talk about the trait approach, leaders, of course, the debate of nature and nurture. If you don't learn about it, you will not really know that, because I'm a proponent of leaders, you can develop leadership. It's not based on the traits. So sometimes these theories would help you. So I get the fact that many people don't know it. And that's why we run CPDs, short workshops, to get people to know about the history of leadership thinking. Now, because of the crisis that we are facing, crisis leadership has become a thing. People are looking at leadership during crisis. How do you lead during a crisis? So most of the time, leadership thinking and leadership evolution and leadership theories, to me, is important because it is usually, we write about the contemporary things that we are facing. And if you want to be able to lead, especially during the times of change, you need to know how it was before and what you can do differently. And that's what makes leadership quite messy, but also very fascinating as well.
Messy, I love messy. Yeah, and Lawrence has put, it's important because great leaders are great learners, and learning is key to effective leadership. And Sanjoy's put, yes, one needs to be aware of the theory, skills, traits to enable to be effective practicing leaders. And Sarah very succinctly has said, yes, there's a couple of dots there, so I'm hoping there might be a follow-on from that, Sarah. You could even unmute and talk to us if you wanted to. Why, Sarah, why do you feel it's important?
I feel it's important because a lot of leadership theories are tried and tested things. So things that have been successful, things that have failed. So it's based on research, isn't it? And myself, I'm from an NHS background within leadership within the NHS. And it's, you know, as a learner, you know, I became an accidental manager. Within the NHS, a lot of managers and leaders tend to be appointed due to their clinical expertise and not necessarily their leadership traits, which was something that I very quickly realised I lacked. And I came back to university to study leadership as a result of that. And it was really important for me because it helped me to have a rationale for the decisions I made based on looking at what had been done previously and what successful theories were out there.
Brilliant, thank you. And I'm just going to note, Anne, I'm noting your comment in the chat that we've moved a long way. We have female leaders now. Let me try and remember to come back to that because I'm just going to move on with the slides, and I've got some thoughts on that. So from my point of view, you know, I love George Santayana, the Spanish philosopher. Those who cannot learn from history are doomed to repeat it. So we've heard some of that coming through about learning from previous, moving on from that. The other thing is, and this links a little bit into your comment, Anne, that our understanding, and whether that's theology, whether it's leadership, whatever it is more influenced by the lenses of our social and cultural context that we see through than we will ever realise. And I think some of these theories, you know, and this I borrowed this from the College of Management and Technology on a defence leadership and management international section. And if we look here, as we said, great man theory was in the Padlet. So Thomas Carlyle in the 1850s and Sir Francis Galton in 1869. Notice great man theory. And what I would say is that, you know, at that point in time, if you ever watched the BBC series Back in Time they've got some brilliant stuff that takes you right back to what UK, we're talking mainly UK, but what the UK was like in the late 1800s. And for us now living in, you know, in 2024, we can sometimes forget the role that women had in society and the role that men had in society, and those very gender and class-based issues through which some of this leadership theory was evolved, because that's what people were observing at the time. And as we can see, we can move through, and on your Padlet, you put many of these theories, situation theory, you put transformational leadership, transactional, all those good things. And then moving on to contemporary thinking now, this is not comprehensive. It's just three different views of, you know, how we can look at leadership, a typology of leadership, whether we think about the person, whether we think about the results, whether we think about leadership as position or leadership as process. Simon Weston, he'll pop up a few times through my talk. Discourses of leadership, the different sort of discourses that we've had through the different ages, and then some, not exclusively, some of the contemporary leadership theory. But my challenge on the besetting issues with leadership thought is it isn't linear. So the problem is leadership is contested. You can think about leadership from the social sciences, you can think about it from theology, you can think about it from business and management, and each of these areas have different understandings and different schemas for understanding reality. So leadership is actually contested. There are thousands of leadership theories. Also, the other thing I've noticed is that new thoughts about leadership don't replace old thoughts. So although Christian, I think you said that, yeah, we can learn from that, we can move on, we can develop. That's true. But when you watch leadership practice in our different environments, in our different settings, what we see is that often people are leading from out-of-date leadership theories that were applicable maybe 100 years ago, but maybe don't work as well today. And some of today's leadership practices are still rooted in those outdated social, historic, intuitive approaches. And that's where I wanted to come back to this women in leadership, because I think when I used to teach leadership at Keele, we used to look at gender, we used to look at issues of gender in leadership, and still today, even though quite a lot of progress has been made, I would say there are still some significant issues around that. Not got time to go into it today, but it might be something that you want to comment on or pick up on. Yeah, Sanjoy, contested definitely in politics. Abiodun, yes, leadership thinking is a series of valuable skills. Chidnima, yes, understanding of evolution. Thank you for those comments. Let's move on to culture because time is moving on. Quick share again. I was going to put, does organisational culture matter? But on the basis I'm talking about it, I'm going to say it does. So let's ask a different question. Why do you think organisational culture matters? Now, I love it when you unmute and you talk, but obviously understand that some of you may not be able to do that because of the context or the environment that you're in. So you might want to use the chat. Please do use the chat, but please unmute and talk as well, please. Why does organisational culture matter?
I think culture is everything in an organization. It sets the tone, it sets the agenda. Culture influences strategy. It influences decision making. Everything. Yeah. The structure, the strategy. In fact, how people are managed within the organization. So I think culture is everything. I remember one book that I came across titled "Culture Eats Strategy for Breakfast." And there is this guy who always say culture is everything. So I think culture matters. Culture is everything. Culture defines everything. Everything revolves around culture. It's like,
Thank you, Lawrence. I think it was Peter Drucker, wasn't it, who coined that phrase? So yeah, thank you. That's brilliant. Anybody else?
Yeah, I would say my name is Andrew.
Hello.
Yeah, I would say that if culture is positive in the organization, it makes people or employees happier and also increases production in the process. Because employees are motivated, and if anything is aligned to organization, then you're talking about the production, motivation, satisfaction because of the positive culture that is in the organization.
Brilliant, thank you. And I see in the chat as well, Gary's put organisational culture map. Love that map, Gary. I'm going to come back to that soon. But thank you for that. Okay.
I was going to say culture, it's a great influencer when you look at leadership. The culture actually influences you, whether unknowingly or knowingly.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And do you know that the majority of leaders I've worked with, and I've always, from the 90s when I did my own MBA, I got really into culture and I really, really felt it was important. But in many of the instances, I haven't noticed that in other leaders. And when I was teaching on the MBA, these 250 executives, most of them, by the end of it, really understood the importance of culture. But at the start, it was a fairly new concept to them, which again, I was really surprised about, but delighted that we could make that difference. So some popular perspectives. We've already heard the Drucker organisational culture eats strategy for breakfast. Someone else has added lunch and dinner. Cheryl Sandberg, I love this. We can't change what we're not aware of, but once we're aware of it, we cannot help but change. And the culture for me, starting to learn about culture and the informal organisation is a little bit like the fog lifting. When I first started to get into this, it was almost like, I was a very analytical person. I was a very logical person. I couldn't work out why in Rolls-Royce, you know, in the division I was working for, there seemed to be some like decisions made that didn't make sense. But as soon as you started learning about politics and power and the informal organisation, all of a sudden you could see that there were lots of different forces at play in the culture of the organisation that influenced decision making. Lou Gessner at IBM said he came to see his time that culture wasn't just one aspect of the game, it is the game. And this was from John Connolly, who was senior partner and chief executive Deloitte UK, talking about, business landscapes changed significantly. There's now a single critical factor that can be identified as being the secret to performance, but there's little doubt that the most significant influence is its culture, which is what people have been saying in the chat and people have been saying on mic. I don't know whether you know Professor Ed Shine. He wrote a brilliant book back in the 80s, Leadership and Culture. It's on its 13th edition now, I think. And this is a picture he sent me of himself just before he died. He did pass away, but just before he did, I'd asked him for a picture that I could use on my online programs because you have to get permission from the author. So he sent this. And the thing that when you read Ed's book or Professor Shine's book, the most important thing a leader can and should do is understand their culture and how they shape it and how they are shaped by it. So this is why I think leadership should be occupied. The most important thing a leader should be occupied with is culture. And there are lots and lots of definitions of organizational culture. Here are a few. The collective common beliefs, behaviors and values of the people, the patterns of beliefs, values, rituals, sentiments, a set of ideas and values. And the simplest was from McKinsey, Marvin Bower. Again, Marvin's passed away, but the way we do things round here. Now that's really good because it's simple, but the simplicity of that sometimes belies the complexity of organizational culture. So I thought just very quickly, I'll run through a few theoretical perspectives that might help you if you haven't sort of been involved in culture before. I'm sure some of you here who've been involved in this for ages will know far more than these. These are the ones that I found helpful. First of all, Shine, coming back to Shine, I find his framework, his assumptions, values and artifacts framework really helpful. It's very simple, sometimes called the iceberg model. It's about delving below the surface so we can see what's happening above the surface, the visible organizational behaviors and structures and processes, but the things that are below the surface. And some of the most valuable to dig into to get clues about culture and leadership are the unconscious, taken for granted beliefs and perceptions and feelings. They're hardest to get to, but the most valuable. The cultural web is a really helpful analytical framework from Exploring Strategy from Johnson et al. These break down, I've used this in organizations to help them understand their culture in terms of the symbols, the power structures, the organizational structures, the control systems, the rituals, routines, the stories, the narratives, the heroes that we tell us that we talk about. And another thing that really came strongly in my PhD was the three historic influences of culture. Of these three, which is the founding leaders' assumptions, organizational learning, and new leader thinking, my PhD really bore this out, that the assumption of the founding leaders is the most critical. Now, my PhD was based on an organization that was formed in 1924. It celebrates its centenary this year. Yet those founding leaders' assumptions about things like local autonomy, not wanting central control, things like that still ripple through and cause leadership issues through the decades that organisation had been in existence. And so 3 questions I would have for us as leaders is, how can we as leaders take more time to better recognise and understand those long history influences of these 3 elements? How can we be intentional about how we learn about organisational culture and how we learn as an organisation? And how can we bring new leader thinking into dialogue with what's happened historically to help us understand and shape culture. And finally, Professor Jo Martin, she would say that a lot of organisational culture theory and thinking looks at a very homogenized, singular, unitarian view of culture. And what she would say is, when you're thinking about culture, don't see it as a single entity. Yes, look at all your subcultures, but also look for ways where culture is integrated, where there is unity, but also where it's differentiated, where is there inconsistency and where are the subcultures, and look for where is culture fragmented, where is the complexity happening and where is the multiplicity. And so her ideas in this sort of three lenses, three ways of seeing culture, helps us to avoid seeing it as this very singular perspective. Not long left now. I think I've only got a few minutes left. So this is one of the lovely. I'm coming back to your comment. I think it was who talked about the map. Someone talked about the map. Gary, you talked about the map. Let me talk about your map, but in a slightly different way, about terroir. And terroir is a French wine growers term that hasn't got an English equivalent, but it's about understanding the alchemy of the soil, its geology, its altitude, its microclimate, how well it's been farmed and how well the land's been tended over the years. It's the cultural history, it's the botany, it's the meteorology, it's the social geography. And I think this is a brilliant metaphor for culture. When we think about our organisations, we can think about culture in this way. So this is the brilliant phrase the quote I wanted to give you. As the Wine Society of 1894 so insightfully posits, gifted growers often make excellent wine in lesser vintages, just as in outstanding years, mediocrity can prove a stronger force than even Mother Nature. And although that's talking about wine production, I would think about that in terms of our organisations. I would say quite often, under the guise of transformational leadership, quite a lot of violence is done to our organisational cultures because boards and leaders are looking for short-term gains, and often they don't understand the damage that they can do to things that are more under the surface, things that are the sustainability of the organisation in terms of things like its goodwill between its employees, the morale and things like that. So you are the viticulturalists of your institution. As we've only got a little bit of time left, could we just, rather than do the Padlet, could we quickly say what do we see as the dominant views of organisations and culture, and what are we noticing that's emerging? Just a couple of minutes. Who would like to say what sort of things have you seen as being dominant thoughts about organisations up until recently, and how is that changing? Anybody got any thoughts? How about organisation as machine? I would say, because of the Industrial Revolution, one of the reasons that managerialism was so contested in higher education and contested in theology, when lots of for-profit ideas about organisations were being transplanted, there was a big kickback. And I would say that's because a lot of our thinking about organisations in the Industrial Revolution was organisation as machine. People like Taylor and Fayol and scientific management, and it was all about productivity. But is productivity the main thing that we should be going for? Came across this more recently from Klaus Schwab, the evolving role of organisations and its people, the different focuses when we were agrarian, industrial, information. And what things have led towards is an upsurge of purpose and the importance of purpose for organisational culture. So you've got Simon Sinek and the Golden Circle, the why. The other one, the colourful one there, is from one of my colleagues who set up his own sort of purpose-centred leadership consultancy there. And then sort of this idea of moving from state-centric to free market to social market to co-creative ecosystems, that idea from ecosystem to ecosystem. And this again ties into Simon Weston's view. His book, Leadership, a Critical Text, sort of lands on this idea of eco-leadership. And he's not talking about eco in the green climate sense, although that's really important. He's talking about that sort of systems approach to leadership. And Christian said earlier, the only thing that's constant is change. It was Heraclitus of Ephesus that said that. And Professor Foster of Sedgley says the only variable is the rate of change, and it's accelerating. And I always like to create a new word for these talks. So I've created a new one called complexicating. It's getting more complex. And I wonder whether when we think about the shifts in the UK and globally, technological shifts, economic shifts, environmental shifts, political, legislative, ethical, leadership thinking, we can think about quite a few emerging paradigms. We've got the fourth industrial revolution, we've got shifting global politics, we've got tribalism, we've got fake news, we've got gender fluidity, we've got global economic crises, we've got the pandemic, we've got artificial intelligence, we've got heightened environmental and climate concerns. There's a global population growth acceleration. There's changing attitudes of Gen X and Gen Z. We've got the gig economy. We've got anxiety culture, mental health crisis, isolation and loneliness. So all of these things are happening more or less at the same time. And you may have come across this before, this acronym of VUCA. It's been around for a few years now, but this idea that we're in a context that's volatile, that's uncertain, that's got increased complexity and increased ambiguity. And that's reminiscent of a wicked problem. I'm just going to quickly whiz past this, but if you've not heard of wicked problems, these are really a really important concept to bring into our leadership and culture thinking, because sometimes we try to solve problems from a paradigm of tame problems that we've seen before. Wicked problems need to be looked at differently. Because we're short on time, I'm going to whiz through that. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the grey zone. This is Mark Sayers' book, and he's talking about Christian leaders. But at the start of it, it is not theological at all. It's just looking at, he's saying our world has entered a grey zone. It's from a 21st century warfare term where it's harder to determine when war begins and when it officially ends. It's the in-between space, a liminal space, you could call it, between the old thing going out and the new thing coming in. And here, the old thing isn't totally gone and the new thing isn't totally here. He calls it a marshy, swampish, brackish time. Christian called it messy, and it is messy. It's that sort of bit in the middle. It's confusing and it's contradictory. And he says that today, all of the evidence points that we are poised at a grey zone in all of these areas. And it's not that we've entered a new era. Instead, we've entered an in-between phase. And the grey zone is the context in which we must learn to lead and to flourish. So does that resonate with you? How might that inform our leadership thinking and our cultural thinking? And finally, to conclude, just 2 minutes before the end, I'm going to put trust as an interlocutor of leadership and culture and change. That thing that is the in-between place. And this is from John Blakey. I sat on the board of the Trusted Executive. His model of 9 habits of trust are really worth looking into. And Charles Green said, leaders can no longer trust in power. Instead, they must rely on the power of trust. And trust exists in several spheres. There's the trust in the executive ability of the leaders. There's trust in the organisation and what it stands for, the purpose. There's trust in the systems and processes, and there's trust in the checks and balances. And what I would say is, where historically has trust been a problem in leadership and organisations that we work in, and how do we as leaders need to build trust for the future? So I don't know whether we've got time for any discussions or thoughts in terms of what's landed from today, in terms of how that might inform your leadership practice, and what one thing might you take away from today. So I shall stop talking now and I shall stop sharing.
Wow. That's amazing. Thank you so much, Professor Foster, for that insightful, electrifying, energetic, engaging, presentation. I think I've learned a great deal. In fact, I feel right now like I've just had a very delicious meal, and this has really kept me thinking, some of the ideas that I've picked from this presentation, I can't wait to start exploring some of those ideas and, having conversation with colleagues, at the JMBS to develop my understanding of those ideas. Thank you so much for this amazing presentation. And I'm pretty sure those in attendance will echo similar sentiments. So I think the floor is open now to questions. Please feel free to ask or mute yourself, ask directly, or you can just type in the chat section and we'll pick that up, and Reverend Professor Foster will respond to any questions you may have. Thank you.
Will, thank you for your politeness, but please call me Will. And I saw you nodding along there. What have you taken out from today? What's your takeout? What are your thoughts?
I think for me, I work with in the team of clinical staff who are developing into a new role in advanced practice. And leadership is a huge component of that, and very much want them to be clinical leaders in the workplace without having the managerial responsibility, but you just be a senior clinical leader. And we've been talking to Christian about kind of working together to kind of create something bespoke, because as you say, the world is changing. The NHS is in crisis. It's got lots of kind of vacancies, and social care has as well. So, it's incumbent on us to try and help develop people for the future to be able to cope with that environment that they're working in. And what I really liked about I'm particularly interested in person-centered leadership, practice development, coming from a clinical background, and that's one of my passions. But that kind of model focuses on the people first rather than the patient, because we in healthcare, we very much focus everything on the patient, but if you don't look after your people, they get burnt out and they become unwell, and then you've not got enough people to look after your patients. So thank you very much. It's been inspiring and refreshing. Thank you.
Brilliant. It reminds me when, I often draw on the automotive industry, because when I was a senior consultant, I was working a lot with the automotive industry. And so I talked about British Leyland in the 70s and Toyota in the 90s. British Leyland in the 70s did all their inspection of quality at the very end of the process. And so although they got all the documentation in place, quite often there'd be a lot of waste, a lot of scrap stuff that wouldn't be right. Whereas Toyota built quality into the process by training their people, by putting the right processes in place. And it's a bit like your patients, isn't it? We do have to be patient-centric, but if we only focus on the patients, we're not focusing on the things that will actually help the patients have that great experience and be healed well. Because if your nurses and your doctors are run ragged and absolutely up against it and don't have enough resources, how on earth can you give the right patient care? So yeah, absolutely. Thanks for sharing that.
We've actually dabbled in Toyota in healthcare, lean in healthcare, but we didn't bring the hearts and minds. We did the systems and processes. So yeah, we try a lot.
Yeah. Any other? It doesn't have to be a question. It could just be an observation or a comment. Oh, I thought we were going to get Sarath giving us a little comment there, but he turned his camera off again.
Sorry, I just joined. I'm not sure what was discussed. Sorry for that.
No problem at all.
Well, thank you so much. Honestly, I've really enjoyed this presentation. So looking at where we are now in terms of leadership and looking at, the global landscape, politically, economically, socially, everything that is going on, where do you see leadership going, say, in the next 5-10 years?
I wish I knew the answer to that, Lawrence. It's a really good question. I'll answer it. I'll try not to be a politician, but I'll answer it slightly differently to the question you've asked. when I said that everything rises and falls on leadership, well, John Maxwell said everything rises and falls on leadership. What that's meant for me is that my biggest focus when I was working directly in industry or in higher education as a leader has been to invest in the leadership development of the teams that are around me, and alongside me and above me, in all fairness. Because I think if you genuinely believe that everything rises and falls on leadership, then your priority has to be to develop your leadership capital. And I think, you know, in the time that I've been interested in leadership theories come and leadership theories go. You know, there are different contexts we're working in, the environment changes. So I think my answer to the question is, regardless of where the latest theories are, we need to know what they are, and we need to know whether they apply and how they apply to our particular context. What I would say, in addition to everything rises and falls on leadership, is that strategic leadership is really important as well. One of the things that I think can be lacking in organizations that has leadership, it can have visionary leadership, but it doesn't necessarily have strategic leadership, even though they might have a strategy. And I would say having a strategy is different to being a strategic leader. So I think that's important. Obviously, culture should occupy, and the question then is, what sort of cultures will our organizations have post-pandemic, artificial intelligence, fourth industrial revolution, changing politics and power? What sort of cultures does that, what impact does that have for our cultures? How do we need to understand the changing nature of our culture in the context of that change? So it doesn't answer where leadership will be, but it maybe gives us some ideas about the sort of things we should be paying attention to make sure we can cope with those changes and what the world gives us in the next 10 to 20 years.
Thank you so much. Given the volatility, I mean, we live in very, one thing that is certain, like you said, is change, and we live in a constant state of flux. And looking at the volatility, which is also reflected in a lot of organizations today, what is the one thing that you can tell leaders in organizations? If you were to say one thing, you know, that leaders can take away from this session, what would it be?
I would come back to what Anne said about people. One of the things that I've noticed with some leadership development is that it can develop some of the higher level skills of the leader, the strategic skills, the process skills, the system skills, but not necessarily the people skills that sit below that. So I would say, as a leader, invest in yourself and invest in not just your knowledge, but also your, you know, I would say things like your emotional intelligence, your curiosity. I'd also, there's another session I'd love to do at some point, Christian, which is less academic, and it's more about self-leadership, and it's about character formation in leaders. And I didn't have time to include it in the slides today, but I think there's a dark side of leadership, and I think this idea of egocentric leadership, moving to ecosystems leadership, requires the leader to do battle with their shadow side, you know, to do things like the Johari window, where you invite other people to reflect on the things that you don't see about yourself, and then process that 360-degree appraisal, those sort of things. But that focus on, I think there are two intelligences. That emotional intelligence has started to get more into the popular domain of leadership development. I think curiosity hasn't yet, but curiosity is an intelligence that is really important as a leader as well. So they're the sort of things that I would advise. You know, invest in yourself, invest in your self-care as well. Because one of the other things I've noticed in leadership, particularly in higher education, you might find this in healthcare as well, is that leaders are really squeezed and they're on display, and the expectations on leaders are often way beyond what a human can carry. But as leaders, we feel that we have to carry that. So thinking about your self-care and your team and how you get support for that's important as well, I think.
Thank you so much. I can see Sarat, you've got your hand up. Over to you, Sarat.
Yeah, even though I was late, but based on the current discussion, maybe you would have discussed it, but I just would like to have a quick query on, like, as you know, the like majority of the SMEs, like based on the reports, it says like 99% of UKs are SMEs. And within that 99%, I would say like more than 70% are the organization that is with less than 10 or 5 employees. Now, for those types of organizations and the leaders within that organization, do you think that they may need to improve their knowledge on leadership, not just based on the experience, but by learning through the help of academia?
Yeah, again, I'll draw on my experience of the Senior Leader MBA, where we had quite a few owner managers, organizations less than 10 employees. And I think going through the process of learning about leadership, culture, strategy, change, HR, finance, and all those other things, not only equip them to understand and run their business better, but certainly in terms of the leadership development elements of that, change their understanding of the relationship between them, their identity, the organization, and the people who are part of that organization. And in one of the, it's really interesting, in one of the exercises I did, we also had a center for entrepreneurial leadership, which was particularly for business owners. So I used to run this sort of self-leadership program with them, and a very simple exercise I did with them. One business owner said he would completely restructure the organization based on an understanding of, it's just a simple strengths and weaknesses, but the idea that historically people have thought strengths are the things that you're good at and weaknesses are the things that you're bad at. So you focus on the things that you're bad at and try and make them better. Whereas the idea I tried to bring into the session was that strengths are the things that give you life, that bring you joy, and weaknesses are the things that drain you. And so as a leader of a small business, what you want to be focusing on are the things that bring you energy, bring you joy, bring you all those, enlivenment, and then make sure that you're delegating the bits that drain you. Even if you're good at that bit, if it really drains you, get somebody else to do it. Just make sure they're good at it as well. So yeah, I think whatever organization you're in, the other thing I'd say, I know that you missed the presentation, but we talked about culture. And one of the things I used to say to the entrepreneurial leaders and the business leaders was that whatever your assumptions are now, whatever the philosophies that you have now, these are the things that will ripple through for decades, and if it's still in business, for centuries. And so think about the way you're behaving. Think about what you're modeling. We saw in the chat, people said about leaders modeling things. Think about those sort of things, because they're the clues that your employees are adjusting their thoughts and their behaviors, and it's building the culture. And if you've got some things that you're doing right now that you feel wouldn't be good to continue through the organization, well, stop it. Stop doing those things and start doing the things that will create a positive, healthy culture leading for the next decade, the next 2 decades, the next century.
So as a continuation for that, I think, isn't it there where the emotional leaderships come in place that can have an effect on whether they will think about it or not?
Yeah, and I think if I take higher education, what makes a brilliant researcher doesn't necessarily make a brilliant leader, because brilliant researchers are quite selfish. They have to be. Often they haven't been given leadership training, so that's quite dictatorial, quite autocratic, or can be. And it's the same. What I found in family businesses and small businesses is that the entrepreneurial skills that are needed to generate the business, to set it up, to keep it going, aren't necessarily the same skills, or the skills need to develop and grow as that organisation grows.
Yeah.
Saw this with the Assemblies of God, the organisation that I looked at. You know, they wanted a loose collection, a loose assembly, a loose fellowship of churches, and they didn't want central government. And because of the miracles that were happening, the evangelism that was happening, the healings, the crusades, loads and loads of people were becoming Christians, and they needed lots and lots more Christian leaders. But their original way that they'd set the organisation up couldn't cope because they hadn't got that central leadership. So yeah, I think what's needed at the start isn't necessarily what will carry the organisation through its growth and maturity.
Thank you.
I think we've got a bit over time. Were we supposed to finish at 5, Christian? Have I taken us over?
I think we have some leeway, so
Yeah.
we have Professor Will here, so we need to maximize the fact that you have you here. But either way, I can see a lot of people are already leaving. I think so. Maybe Lawrence again.
Yeah. Any other questions, please, before we wrap up for the day? Okay. So in the absence of any other questions, we just want to hand over to Professor Christian Harrison to give us maybe closing remarks.
No, thanks. First, thank you so much, Lawrence, for leading on this. It's been a pleasure. You've done this for quite a while, and you do it very well. So thank you so much for all you put into this. And of course, thank you so much, Will. I think what you did in 1 hour, you just summarized leadership and culture. That was fascinating. It was more like, wow, you just gave us the leadership and culture lecture in 1 hour. So that was great. I really enjoyed it. It was very engaging, very interactive. And I'm sure I'm talking to everybody that we want to have you next time, clearly. So I'm happy you said it. And I know it's being recorded, so we're going to get you back next time and very, very soon, because there's a lot of things we learned a lot from what you've said, from your wealth of experience as well. And it can't be Will without talking about wicked problems. So when I saw wicked problems, I was like, yeah, this is real. So you always talk about wicked problems. I've heard you talk a lot. So I was like, okay, when am I going to hear wicked problems? So when next time, definitely we get to know much more. And like you spoke about dark leadership, really, that's important, because nowadays you see toxic leaders, psychopathic leaders, dark leadership behaviors. I think I'm running a special issue in the British Journal of Management where we're looking at dark leadership, because is important, knowing why leaders are dark and the dark leadership behaviors. So these are the kind of things that we expect to see. But either way, thank you so much, Will, for the engaging presentation. From the feedback from the chat, some people have had to go, but we all totally agree that we learned a lot about the messiness and, of course, the complexities of leadership as well. And finally, to everybody that has been here, from Anne to Sarah to Joakim to Sarah, Sanjo, everybody that I can see, I think James, Chidima, Andrew, Ejoma, Gary, and even those I couldn't mention, Abiodun and others. Thank you so much for being part of this. And like Lawrence rightly pointed out, these seminars, we have them every month. So please watch our LinkedIn space. Follow us on LinkedIn if you're not already following us already. Follow us on Twitter. You would see this fascinating presentation by Will on our YouTube channel as well. So I'm sure that when you go back again, you will learn a lot. So that's why we record this. So please go back and watch it as well. So it's great to have Will here. And finally, like I said, our conference is on 24th and 25th of June. So please, would love to have you. So if you're not registered, register for it. That's going to be in Bolton. So the Developing Leadership Capacity Conference. So please register. It's on our website as well. But either way, so that's all for me. Thank you so much, everybody, for attending. I had a great time, and I think, Will, you really made our day. So thank you as well.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. I think, Professor Christian Harrison, you've summarized everything, and Will, thank you so much. I think we can't thank you enough, but you know, we have to say it anyway. Thank you so much for this amazing presentation. And I think we will continue to learn from your insights and perspective as we watch the video and we engage in conversations on some of the really exciting ideas that you've shared with us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lawrence, and thank you, everyone. It's been a real
Thank you.
pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank
All
you,
right. Bye
Professor.
for now.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Thanks, Will.
I'm gonna stop recording.